Marcus Thompson stared at the crumpled remains of his physics homework scattered across the hallway floor, equations and diagrams torn beyond recognition. His jaw clenched as he watched Blake Harrison and his crew laugh, their voices echoing off the lockers like hyenas celebrating a fresh kill. The paper that had taken him 3 hours to complete the night before now looked like confetti, and Blake wasn't finished. "Oops," Blake sneered, grinding his heel into a torn page. "Looks like the new kid's gonna fail his first week at Riverside High. What a shame." His followers Tyler Brooks and Mason Cole snickered, forming a semicircle around the destruction. Students in the hallway pretended not to notice, hurrying past with their heads down, grateful it wasn't them in the crosshairs. Marcus bent down, slowly collecting the pieces of his ruined work. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep them steady. The breathing exercises his father had taught him kicked in automatically. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. Control the rage, channel the energy. But watching Blake's smug expression made every muscle in his body coil like a spring. "You know what's funny?" Blake continued, clearly enjoying the audience gathering at a safe distance. "Your daddy probably thinks sending you to a new school is gonna fix whatever's broken in your head. But trash is trash, no matter where you dump it." He kicked another torn page, sending it skidding across the polished floor. The insult hit deeper than Blake could have imagined. Marcus's father Jake had sacrificed everything to get his son into Riverside High after the incident at Oakwood Academy. 3 jobs, double shifts at the Martinez boxing gym, selling his car to afford the transfer fees and new uniforms. The old man's weathered hands bore the calluses of a man who fought for every dollar, every opportunity he could give his son. "Pick it up," Marcus said quietly, still crouched on the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. Blake leaned down, cupping his ear theatrically. "What was that, new boy? Speak up so everyone can hear you beg." Marcus rose to his full height, and for the first time, Blake noticed the newcomer wasn't the easy target he'd assumed. Marcus stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled out his Riverside High polo shirt, his dark eyes holding a stillness that made Blake's friends unconsciously take a step back. There was something predatory in the way Marcus moved, like a boxer sizing up an opponent in the ring. "I said pick it up," Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been in far worse situations than a high school hallway. Confrontation. Tyler Brooks, sensing his leader's momentary hesitation, decided to escalate. "Or what, tough guy? You gonna cry to Principal Rodriguez? Maybe call Daddy to come save you?" He shoved Marcus hard in the chest, expecting the new kid to stumble backward. Marcus didn't budge. Years of absorbing punches from fighters twice his size had turned his core into solid steel. Tyler's push felt like a gentle breeze against a mountain. The hallway grew quiet as students sensed the shift in energy, phones appearing in hands as the possibility of a fight became real. "Last chance," Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made Tyler's confidence waver. "Pick up my homework, apologize, and we can pretend this never happened." Blake's face flushed red with embarrassment. A crowd was forming, and backing down now would destroy his reputation as Riverside High's top enforcer. He'd built his social status on intimidation and fear, and this transfer student was threatening everything he'd worked to establish. "You think you're tough?" Blake spat, stepping closer until he was inches from Marcus's face. "I don't know what kind of school you came from, but here at Riverside, I make the rules. And rule number 1 is respect your superiors." He jabbed his finger into Marcus's chest, punctuating each word with another poke. The third poke never landed. Marcus's hand moved with lightning speed, catching Blake's wrist in a grip that made the bully's eyes widen with shock. For 5 seconds, neither moved, but Blake's face began to contort with pain as Marcus's fingers found pressure points his father had shown him years ago. "My homework," Marcus said simply, applying just enough pressure to make Blake's knees buckle slightly. Now, the hallway held its collective breath. Blake Harrison, the undisputed king of Riverside High's social hierarchy, was being dominated by a kid who'd been at the school for exactly 4 days. Tyler and Mason looked at each other uncertainly, unsure whether to help their leader or run. Blake's pride warred with the increasing pain in his wrist. He'd never encountered resistance like this before, never faced someone who matched his aggression with such controlled violence. There was something military about the way Marcus carried himself, a precision that suggested formal training rather than street fighting. "You're making a big mistake," Blake hissed through gritted teeth, trying to maintain his dignity even as Marcus's grip made his fingers go numb. "The only mistake," Marcus replied, his voice never rising above conversational level, "was thinking I'd let you disrespect my father's sacrifice." He released Blake's wrist so suddenly that the bully stumbled backward, nearly falling into his own followers. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The reputation that followed Marcus Thompson through the doors of Riverside High School was like a storm cloud heavy with rumors and whispered warnings. Students who'd never seen him fight somehow knew about the incident at Oakwood Academy, how he'd single-handedly taken on 3 senior football players and put one in the hospital with a broken orbital bone. The details grew more dramatic with each telling, transforming Marcus from a troubled teenager into something approaching an urban legend. Principal Rodriguez had made the warnings crystal clear during their enrollment meeting. Her office walls were covered with academic achievement certificates and anti-bullying campaign posters, creating an atmosphere of enforced positivity that felt hollow to Marcus. She'd reviewed his file with the careful attention of someone handling explosive materials, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she scanned the disciplinary reports from his previous school. "Mr. Thompson, I want to be absolutely transparent with you," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many promising students throw away their futures. "Riverside High has a zero-tolerance policy regarding violence of any kind. We don't care about your family circumstances, your previous school's failings, or whatever provoked your past incidents. One fight, one threatening gesture, one moment of lost control, and you'll be looking at alternative education programs for the rest of your high school career." His father, Jake, sat beside him in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his work-worn hands folded carefully in his lap. The man had aged 5 years in the past 6 months. The stress of Marcus's expulsion and the financial strain of finding a new school, carving deep lines around his eyes. Jake Thompson was a proud man who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before, opening Martinez Boxing Gym with his savings and a small business loan. Watching his son's academic future hang by a thread was harder than anything he'd faced in combat. "He understands, ma'am," Jake had said, his voice carrying the respectful tone he'd learned in the military when addressing superior officers. "Marcus knows this is his final opportunity to prove he can control his temper and focus on his education. We won't waste the chance you're giving him." Marcus had nodded, but the words felt like sandpaper in his throat. Control his temper. The phrase made it sound like he was some kind of wild animal who flew into rages without provocation. Nobody ever asked what had driven him to that breaking point at Oakwood Academy, what the 3 football players had been doing to Danny Martinez in the locker room when Marcus found them. Nobody cared about the context, only the consequences. Now standing in the hallway with Blake Harrison's crew surrounding him and his torn homework scattered at his feet, those warnings echoed in his mind like a countdown timer. Principal Rodriguez's office was less than 50 yards away. One phone call from any of the students recording this confrontation would end everything his father had sacrificed to provide. But watching Blake grind his heel into 3 hours of careful work, seeing the smug satisfaction on the bully's face as he destroyed something that represented Marcus's genuine effort to start fresh, ignited something deeper than anger. It was the same protective instinct that had gotten him expelled from Oakwood Academy, the same inability to stand by while someone with power abused those who couldn't fight back. The hallway buzzed with tension as more students gathered, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see if the stories about the dangerous new kid were true. Some looked hopeful, tired of Blake's reign of terror and desperate to see him challenged. Others seemed hungry for drama, already composing social media posts about the fight they were about to witness. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders. He thought about his father's sacrifices, about Principal Rodriguez's warnings, about the alternative education program that awaited him if he made the wrong choice. But he also thought about the torn homework at his feet, about the message Blake was sending to every student in the hallway, about the kind of person he wanted to be when faced with injustice. The next few seconds would determine whether Marcus Thompson's story at Riverside High would be one of redemption or repeated failure. Either way, Blake Harrison was about to discover that some mistakes carry consequences far beyond what the person making them ever imagined. The silence in Principal Rodriguez's office felt heavier than the weight Marcus carried in the boxing ring. Her desk was positioned strategically between two large windows that overlooked the student parking lot, where he could see Blake Harrison lean against a silver pickup truck, gesturing wildly to his friends while pointing back toward the school building. The principal's fingers drummed against a manila folder that Marcus recognized as his transfer file, thick with incident reports and psychological evaluations that painted him as a walking time bomb. 17 witnesses, Mr. Thompson, Principal Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd had this conversation too many times before. 17 students recorded various portions of what happened in the hallway, and every single video shows you initiating physical contact with Blake Harrison. She opened the folder and pulled out a printed screenshot from someone's phone, showing Marcus gripping Blake's wrist with what the image made look like brutal force. Marcus stared at the photo, recognizing the exact moment when Blake's arrogance had cracked for the first time. The image didn't capture the 3 hours of work scattered across the floor, or Blake's heel grinding mathematical equations into illegible fragments. It didn't show Tyler Brooks shoving him or Mason Cole's taunting laughter. Social media had a way of stripping context from conflict, reducing complex situations to digestible moments that supported whatever narrative people wanted to believe. Ma'am, with respect, those videos don't show what led up to that moment, Marcus said carefully, trying to keep his voice level despite the frustration building in his chest. Blake Harrison and his friends destroyed my physics homework, then physically confronted me when I asked them to clean it up. I defended myself using minimal force necessary to de-escalate the situation. Principal Rodriguez removed her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her default response to complicated disciplinary situations. Behind her desk, motivational posters about academic excellence and personal responsibility created an ironic backdrop to their conversation about violence and consequences. Mr. Thompson, I've been an educator for 23 years, and I've heard every justification imaginable for student altercations. The facts remain simple. You were warned about our zero-tolerance policy regarding physical confrontations, and less than a week later, you're involved in exactly the kind of incident we discussed. She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. I want to help you succeed here, but I can't ignore clear violations of school policy just because you believe your actions were justified. The door to the office opened without a knock, and Jake Thompson stepped inside wearing his work clothes from the morning shift at Martinez Boxing Gym. His steel-toed boots were still dusty from moving equipment, and his face carried the worried expression of a father who'd received an emergency phone call during the middle of his workday. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized his father had been pulled away from the gym during their busiest hours, losing income they couldn't afford to sacrifice. "Sorry I'm late," Jake said, his military bearing evident even in casual clothes. "Had to arrange coverage at the gym and couldn't find parking." He took the empty chair beside Marcus, and the principal's demeanor immediately shifted to accommodate the presence of a parent. Jake Thompson commanded respect without demanding it, his quiet confidence filling the room in a way that made everyone sit a little straighter. Principal Rodriguez repeated her summary of the incident, showing Jake the same screenshot and emphasizing the 17 witness accounts that corroborated Blake Harrison's version of events. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus watched his father's face remain impassive, but he could see the muscle in his jaw twitching, a tell that Jake was fighting to control his own temper. "Have you spoken with any of these 17 witnesses directly?" Jake asked when the principal finished her presentation. "Because in my experience, crowds tend to see what they expect to see, especially when someone's reputation precedes them." His voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to dealing with authority figures, respectful but not deferential. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your desire to defend your son, but we have clear documentation of a physical altercation that Marcus initiated. The circumstances leading up to the incident don't change the fact that he chose violence over walking away." Principal Rodriguez's tone suggested she'd had similar conversations with defensive parents countless times before. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Ma'am, you mentioned 17 witnesses, but I'm curious about something. In all those videos and witness statements, did anyone mention what happened to Marcus's homework? Because when I dropped him off this morning, he had a completed physics assignment that he'd spent 3 hours working on last night. I watched him triple-check every calculation because he wanted to make a good impression on his new teachers." The question caught Principal Rodriguez off guard, and Marcus could see her mentally reviewing the incident reports. The destroyed homework had been mentioned in passing by a few witnesses, but the focus had been entirely on the physical confrontation that followed. In the rush to document the violence, the property destruction that precipitated it had been relegated to background details. "Property damage doesn't justify physical retaliation," she said finally, but her tone had lost some of its certainty. "Students lose assignments, have materials destroyed, face academic setbacks all the time. We expect them to report these incidents to teachers or administrators, not take matters into their own hands." Marcus felt something snap inside his chest, a combination of frustration and disbelief that made his hands clench involuntarily. "So Blake Harrison can destroy my work, humiliate me in front of half the school, and physically confront me when I object, but I'm the one facing suspension because I didn't let him continue?" His voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "What message does that send to every student who gets bullied? Keep your head down, accept the abuse, and hope the adults eventually notice?" "Marcus," Jake warned quietly, recognizing the dangerous edge creeping into his son's voice. They'd had countless conversations about controlling emotional responses, about the difference between righteous anger and destructive rage. But watching his son face punishment for standing up to a bully was testing Jake's own ability to remain diplomatic. Principal Rodriguez stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the parking lot where Blake Harrison was still holding court with his followers. "Mr. Thompson, your son's academic record from Oakwood Academy shows exceptional potential. His test scores, his essay writing, his mathematical aptitude are all well above average. But his disciplinary record tells a different story entirely. 3 violent incidents in 2 years, each escalating in severity, each following the same pattern of perceived injustice leading to physical retaliation." She turned back to face them, her expression genuinely conflicted. "I have a school full of students who deserve to feel safe in their learning environment. If I allow one student to use violence whenever they feel wronged, where does that lead us? How do I explain to Blake Harrison's parents that their son was physically intimidated because he engaged in typical teenage misbehavior? The characterization of Blake's actions as typical teenage misbehavior hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could feel his father's anger building, the careful control that Jake maintained in all situations beginning to crack under the weight of institutional indifference. Typical teenage misbehavior, Jake repeated slowly, his voice taking on a tone that Marcus recognized from their most serious conversations. Ma'am, with all due respect, if someone destroyed my property, taunted me about my family's sacrifices, and then physically confronted me when I objected, I'd consider that harassment and intimidation, not typical misbehavior. The fact that it happened in a high school hallway doesn't change the nature of the actions. Principal Rodriguez returned to her desk, her hands folding over Marcus's file as if she could somehow contain the complexity of the situation within its Manila borders. Mr. Thompson, I understand your perspective, but I have to consider the broader implications of every disciplinary decision I make. If I excuse your son's actions because he felt justified, what happens the next time a student decides to take justice into their own hands? The question revealed the impossible position that educators faced, caught between protecting potential victims and preventing vigilante justice. Marcus could see the genuine struggle in Principal Rodriguez's expression, the weight of trying to balance competing interests while maintaining order in an environment where teenagers tested boundaries every single day. But he could also see the fundamental flaw in her reasoning, the way institutional policies often protected aggressors while punishing those who refused to accept abuse. Blake Harrison would face no consequences for destroying property or initiating physical confrontation because he'd been careful to stay within the technical boundaries of plausible deniability. Marcus, meanwhile, faced suspension or expulsion for refusing to be victimized. The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid, but he forced himself to remain silent as his father continued advocating for him. This was bigger than one incident or one school. This was about the kind of person Marcus would become, the lessons he would carry forward about standing up for what was right versus accepting what was expedient. Outside the window, Blake Harrison climbed into his pickup truck, laughing at something one of his friends had said. Tomorrow he would return to school with his reputation intact, his power unchallenged, his behavior validated by an institutional response that prioritized order over justice. And Marcus would either learn to accept that reality or find himself on the outside looking in once again. The morning air carried the scent of fresh rain as Marcus walked through the parking lot of Riverside High, his backpack heavy with makeup assignments and the weight of his 3-day suspension. Students clustered around cars and benches shot glances in his direction, some curious, others wary, all of them having heard various versions of what had happened in the hallway. Principal Rodriguez had made her decision clear. Zero tolerance meant zero exceptions, regardless of provocation or circumstances. Danny Rivera sat alone on a concrete bench near the bike racks, his slight frame hunched over a notebook as he frantically scribbled equations. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked, completely absorbed in whatever assignment demanded his attention. Marcus had noticed him before, always studying, always alone, always carrying books that looked too heavy for his thin shoulders. There was something familiar about Danny's isolation, the way he seemed to exist on the periphery of high school social dynamics without quite belonging anywhere. The morning bell rang across the campus, sending students streaming toward the main building in the organized chaos that marked the beginning of another school day. Danny gathered his materials quickly, stuffing papers into an overloaded backpack that had seen better days. As he stood to join the migration toward first period, his chemistry notebook slipped from his grip, spilling loose pages across the wet pavement. Marcus watched from 30 yards away as Danny scrambled to collect his work, panic evident in his movements. The pages were getting soaked, ink beginning to run as puddles claimed sheets of carefully written notes and completed homework assignments. Other students walked past without stopping, too focused on their own concerns to notice one person's academic disaster unfolding at their feet. Blake Harrison emerged from the main building, flanked by Tyler Brooks and Mason Cole, his expression brightening when he spotted Danny's predicament. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the predatory look in Blake's eyes, the same expression he'd worn while grinding physics equations under his heel. The three boys changed direction, moving toward Danny with the casual confidence of sharks sensing blood in the water. Well, what do we have here?" Blake called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Looks like little Danny Rivera is having some trouble managing his homework." He stepped deliberately on one of the loose pages, his boot heel leaving a muddy imprint across what appeared to be a completed chemistry lab report. Danny looked up from his hands and knees, water and ink staining his fingertips as he tried to salvage what remained of his work. "Please, Blake, I need those notes for today's test. I spent all weekend working on that lab report." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone who understood that academic performance wasn't just about grades, but about the future opportunities that depended on maintaining perfect scores. Tyler Brooks kicked another page into a deeper puddle, watching the paper absorb dirty water until it became illegible. "Maybe next time you'll remember to help us out when we need assistance with our own assignments. You know, like a good classmate would do." The implication was clear. Danny's academic integrity came with a price that Blake's crew expected him to pay. Marcus found himself walking closer, drawn by the familiar injustice of the scene. Danny Rivera wasn't just losing homework. He was being systematically victimized by students who saw his dedication to education as both a resource to exploit and a weakness to attack. The wet pages scattered across the pavement represented hours of careful work, the kind of effort that students like Danny couldn't afford to lose. "You know what I think?" Blake continued, crouching down to Danny's eye level with mock concern. "I think you need to learn about priorities. Maybe if you spent less time being a teacher's pet and more time being helpful to your fellow students, you wouldn't find yourself in situations like this." He picked up Danny's chemistry notebook, the one that had started the entire disaster, and held it just out of reach. Danny stretched toward the notebook, his voice breaking slightly as he pleaded, "Blake, please, that has 3 weeks of notes for the midterm exam. My mom works double shifts at the restaurant just so I can focus on school instead of getting a job. I can't fail this class." The desperation in his words revealed the broader context of his academic pressure, the family sacrifices that made every grade feel like a matter of survival rather than mere achievement. Mason Cole laughed at Danny's distress, clearly enjoying the power dynamic at play. "Listen to him begging. Maybe we should teach him some dignity, along with proper prioritization." He raised his foot over the chemistry notebook, preparing to destroy weeks of careful work with a single stomp. The scene crystallized in Marcus's mind with perfect clarity. Danny Rivera represented everything that was wrong with the social hierarchy at Riverside High, where bullies could destroy others' futures for entertainment while administrators worried more about maintaining order than protecting victims. This wasn't about teenage misbehavior or typical high school drama. This was about predators systematically targeting someone who couldn't fight back. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording, his finger finding the camera app with practiced ease. The red recording light appeared on his screen as he captured Blake's sneering face, Tyler's casual cruelty, and Mason's raised foot hovering over Danny's notebook. If Principal Rodriguez wanted documentation of student behavior, he would provide exactly that. The camera captured Blake's voice clearly as he continued taunting Danny. "You know what your problem is, Rivera? You think being smart makes you special. But intelligence without strength is just vulnerability waiting to be exploited. He tossed the chemistry notebook into the air, letting it fall toward a puddle with deliberate slowness. Danny lunged forward, catching the notebook before it hit the water, but his desperate movement left him off balance and exposed. Mason Cole's foot connected with his shoulder, sending him sprawling face first into the muddy pavement. The impact scattered the remaining homework papers across a wider area, some of them sliding towards storm drains where they would be lost forever. "Oops," Mason said with theatrical innocence. "Guess you should work on your coordination along with your attitude." He ground his heel into another page, the sound of tearing paper audible even from Marcus's position. Blake's attention turned to the scattered assignments, his expression lighting up with malicious inspiration. "You know what, guys? I think Danny needs to learn a lesson about the value of hard work. Let's help him understand that some things are more fragile than others." He began systematically tearing pages from the chemistry notebook, each rip calculated to maximize psychological impact. Marcus watched through his phone screen as weeks of Danny's careful work was destroyed with methodical precision. Each torn page represented hours of study, nights spent at the kitchen table while his mother worked late shifts to support their family. The academic devastation was personal and deliberate, designed to cause maximum educational damage while staying technically within the bounds of property destruction rather than physical violence. The recording captured everything: Blake's calculated cruelty, Tyler and Mason's eager participation, and Danny's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage what remained of his assignments. Other students walked past, some watching with uncomfortable fascination, others averting their eyes to avoid becoming targets themselves. The institutional failure was complete, creating an environment where victims had no protection and witnesses had no incentive to intervene. Danny's voice cracked as he tried one final appeal. "Blake, please. I'll do whatever you want. I'll help. With your homework, I'll let you copy my tests. Just please stop destroying my work. I need these assignments to pass chemistry." His offer to compromise his own academic integrity revealed the impossible position that systematic bullying created, forcing victims to choose between their principles and their survival. Blake paused in his destruction, pretending to consider Danny's proposal. "That's interesting, Rivera. You're finally learning how negotiation works. But here's the thing about respect. It has to be earned, and you can't earn it by groveling in puddles." He tore another page from the notebook, watching Danny's face crumble with each destroyed assignment. Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same protective instinct that had gotten him suspended from Riverside High and expelled from Oakwood Academy before that. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to intervene, to use the skills his father had taught him to stop this systematic victimization of someone who couldn't defend himself. But Principal Rodriguez's warnings echoed in his mind, along with his father's sacrifices and the alternative education program that awaited him if he made the wrong choice. The phone in his hands offered a different path, a way to document injustice without becoming the aggressor. For the first time in his academic career, Marcus Thompson had to choose between immediate action and strategic patience. The choice he made in the next 30 seconds would determine not just Danny Rivera's academic future, but the kind of person Marcus would become when faced with the eternal question of whether to stand up or stand by. The decision crystallized in Marcus's mind like ice forming on a winter window. He stopped recording and slipped his phone into his pocket, his feet already carrying him toward the confrontation before his rational mind could override the impulse. Danny Rivera's desperate attempts to salvage his destroyed homework triggered something deeper than anger in Marcus's chest, a recognition of helplessness that connected to his own experiences of being targeted and isolated. "Having fun, Blake?" Marcus called out as he approached, his voice cutting through the morning air with quiet authority. The three bullies turned toward him, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to wary calculation. Blake's hand paused mid-tier, still holding half of Danny's chemistry notes, as he processed the unexpected interruption to his entertainment. Tyler Brooks stepped forward, puffing out his chest in what Marcus recognized as a classic intimidation display. "Well, look who's back from vacation. Thought you'd learned your lesson about sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Thompson." His voice carried false bravado, but Marcus could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes as he remembered their previous encounter in the hallway. Marcus ignored Tyler completely, focusing his attention on Blake while Danny scrambled to collect what remained of his scattered assignments. "I was just thinking about our conversation with Principal Rodriguez. You know, the one where she talked about typical teenage misbehavior versus harassment and intimidation." He gestured toward the torn papers and Danny's mud-stained clothes. "I'm curious which category this falls into." Blake released the torn notebook pages, letting them flutter to the ground like academic confetti. His expression hardened as he realized Marcus wasn't going to back down or walk away. "This is none of your business, suspension boy. Why don't you go find somewhere else to play hero before you get yourself kicked out of another school?" The taunt hit its intended target, but Marcus had spent 3 days thinking about exactly this kind of confrontation. His father's training had emphasized that real strength came from choosing your battles wisely, not from proving your toughness in every possible situation. But sometimes, Jake had taught him, the battle chooses you, and walking away becomes a form of cowardice that eats at your soul. "Actually, Blake, I think this is exactly my business," Marcus replied, pulling his phone back out and restarting the recording. "See, I've been documenting how you and your friends operate. Systematic destruction of other students' property, intimidation tactics, coordinated harassment campaigns. It's fascinating from an anthropological perspective." Mason Cole lunged toward Marcus, reaching for the phone with clumsy desperation. "Give me that thing before I shove it down your throat." His movement was telegraphed and amateur, exactly the kind of wild aggression that Marcus had learned to exploit in the boxing ring. Without thinking, Marcus sidestepped and used Mason's momentum to send him stumbling past, nearly colliding with a concrete bench. The maneuver took less than 2 seconds and required minimal physical contact, but its effect on the group dynamic was immediate and profound. Mason's failed grab revealed the gap between Blake's crew's reputation for toughness and their actual fighting ability. Tyler's earlier bravado evaporated as he watched his friend flail helplessly, and Blake's confident smirk faltered as he realized he was dealing with someone who possessed genuine combat skills. Danny Rivera looked up from his position on the wet pavement, his eyes wide with a mixture of amazement and terror. "Marcus, please, just leave it alone. They'll make it worse for me later if you get involved." His voice carried the weary resignation of someone who'd learned that resistance only escalated the abuse he suffered. "No, Danny, they won't," Marcus said firmly, his attention still focused on Blake while maintaining peripheral awareness of Tyler and Mason's positions. "Because this ends today. Right here, right now." He held up his phone, making sure the camera captured all 3 bullies clearly. "Blake, you have exactly 10 seconds to pick up every piece of Danny's homework and apologize for destroying his property." Blake's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. The public ultimatum, delivered in front of witnesses and recorded for posterity, represented a direct challenge to his authority that he couldn't ignore without losing face completely. "You think you can threaten me, you psycho freak? I know about your little anger management problems. One phone call to Rodriguez, and you're gone." "Make the call," Marcus replied calmly, his voice carrying no trace of the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Explain to her how you were systematically destroying another student's homework when I asked you to stop. Show her the video of you tearing up lab reports while Danny begged you to leave his work alone. I'm sure she'd be very interested in your definition of typical teenage behavior." The standoff stretched across several heartbeats, with other students beginning to notice the confrontation and drift closer to watch. Marcus could feel the familiar weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders, the same moment of choice that had defined every significant conflict in his academic career. But this time felt different, more calculated, and less emotional than his previous encounters with bullies. Tyler Brooks tried to reassert himself, stepping closer to Marcus with renewed aggression. "You're outnumbered 3-1, hotshot." Maybe the odds were different when you sucker punched Blake in the hallway, but this time we're ready for your little karate tricks. His voice carried more conviction than his body language, which remained tense and uncertain. Marcus smiled, and the expression sent a chill through all three bullies. It wasn't the wild grin of someone losing control, but the cold calculation of a predator who'd identified his prey's weaknesses. "Tyler, I need you to understand something very clearly. I don't do karate, I box. And the fundamental difference is that karate is about discipline and self-control, while boxing is about hitting people until they stop moving." The distinction landed with visceral impact, painting a picture of violence that was more systematic and brutal than anything the bullies had imagined. Mason Cole took an unconscious step backward, his earlier aggression replaced by genuine fear as he processed the implications of Marcus's words. Blake tried to regain control of the situation, but his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his growing anxiety. "You're insane if you think you can take all three of us. This isn't some movie where the hero beats impossible odds through pure determination." He gestured toward the gathering crowd of students. "There are witnesses everywhere. You throw one punch and your academic career is over." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Blake's argument seriously. "You're absolutely right about the witnesses, Blake, which is why I'm not going to throw any punches." He took a step closer, his movement fluid and controlled. "But here's what you might not have considered. I don't need to hit you to hurt you." The threat hung in the air like smoke, ambiguous enough to avoid technically crossing principle. Rodriguez's lines, while specific enough to communicate genuine menace. Marcus had learned from his father that psychological warfare often proved more effective than physical violence, especially when dealing with bullies who relied on intimidation rather than actual fighting ability. Danny Rivera struggled to his feet, clutching the salvageable remains of his homework against his chest like precious artifacts. "Marcus, please, just let it go. The assignments aren't worth getting expelled over." His plea carried genuine concern for Marcus's welfare, the kind of empathy that bullies like Blake couldn't understand or appreciate. "Danny's right about one thing," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Blake's face. "These assignments aren't worth getting expelled over, but the principle behind them absolutely is." He gestured toward the torn papers scattered across the wet pavement. "This isn't about chemistry homework or lab reports. This is about whether bullies get to destroy other people's futures for entertainment, while everyone else stands around and watches." Blake's crew began to understand that they'd miscalculated the situation entirely. Marcus Thompson wasn't the uncontrolled rage monster from the rumors, but something far more dangerous, a skilled fighter with tactical intelligence and moral conviction. The combination made him unpredictable in ways that traditional bullying tactics couldn't address. The morning sun broke through the cloud cover, casting long shadows across the courtyard as the confrontation reached its critical moment. Students formed a loose circle around the participants, phones appearing in hands as the possibility of violence drew their attention like moths to flame. But Marcus remained perfectly still, his presence alone creating enough tension to keep Blake's crew paralyzed with indecision. 10 seconds, Blake," Marcus repeated quietly. "Pick up Danny's homework and apologize, or discover exactly what happens when you push someone who's tired of watching good people get destroyed by cowards who mistake cruelty for strength." Blake Harrison's facade crumbled like a house of cards in a windstorm. The calculated cruelty that had defined his reputation at Riverside High melted away. replaced by something Marcus had never seen before: genuine fear. Not the performative anxiety that students displayed when facing detention or failing grades, but the primal terror of someone who suddenly realized they'd awakened something far more dangerous than they could handle. Okay, Blake stammered, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old's. I'll pick up the papers. Just back off, man. He dropped to his knees with shaking hands, scrambling to collect the scattered remains of Danny's chemistry homework. The torn pages stuck to his palms as he tried to gather them, ink bleeding across his fingers like evidence of his cruelty. Tyler Brooks and Mason Cole watched their leader's capitulation with expressions of stunned disbelief. The social hierarchy they'd built their identities around was collapsing in real time, their untouchable status evaporating under Marcus's unwavering stare. Neither moved to help Blake, too paralyzed by their own fear to maintain even the pretense of loyalty. Danny. Rivera stood frozen, clutching his salvaged notebook against his chest as he processed the impossible scene unfolding before him. In his 3 years at Riverside High, he'd never seen Blake Harrison back down from anyone, let alone scramble in the mud collecting homework like a disciplined child. The power dynamic that had governed his daily existence was being rewritten. With every torn page Blake carefully retrieved, Marcus maintained his position, hands relaxed at his sides, but ready to respond to any sudden movement. His father's training had taught him that victory wasn't always about landing punches. Sometimes it was about making your opponent defeat themselves through their own fear and poor decisions. Blake's public humiliation would spread through the school faster than any physical beating, and the psychological impact would last far longer. "The apology, Blake," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the morning air with surgical precision. "Danny's waiting." He gestured toward the slight boy, who still looked like he couldn't believe what was happening. The crowd of students pressed closer, phones recording every moment of Blake Harrison's fall from grace. Blake looked up from his position on the wet pavement, his face flushed with shame and rage. "I'm sorry, Danny. I'm sorry I destroyed your homework. It won't happen again." The words came out forced and bitter, but they were audible enough for the recording phones to capture clearly. Danny nodded slowly, accepting the apology with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that this moment would change everything between them. "Thank you, Blake. I just want to focus on my studies and help my family. I never wanted any trouble with you or your friends." Marcus stepped back, giving Blake space to finish collecting the torn pages. "Tyler, Mason, you might want to help your friend there. Looks like he's having trouble managing all that paper by himself." His suggestion carried the weight of a command, and both boys immediately dropped to their knees to assist Blake in his humiliating task. The transformation was complete. Blake Harrison, the undisputed king of Riverside High's social hierarchy, knelt in muddy water collecting homework papers while his former victims watched. The students recording the scene captured every detail of his degradation, ensuring that this moment would become part of school legend within hours. As Blake and his crew finished gathering the destroyed assignments, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. He pulled out his own chemistry notebook, pristine and complete, and handed it to Danny. "You can copy my notes for today's test. I finished the lab report yesterday if you need to reference the format." Danny's eyes widened as he accepted the notebook, his hands trembling slightly as he processed the unexpected kindness. "Marcus, I can't take this. What about your own test?" His voice carried genuine concern despite everything he'd just endured. "I'll be fine," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "I've got a good memory for chemistry equations. Besides, helping each other out is what students should do, right, Blake?" He directed the question toward the bully, who was still kneeling in the mud with torn papers clutched in his fists. Blake's response came out as barely a whisper. "Right, students should help each other." The admission felt like pulling teeth, but the presence of recording phones and Marcus's unwavering attention left him no choice but to comply. The morning bell rang across the campus, signaling the end of the confrontation and sending students streaming toward their first period classes. The crowd began to disperse, but not before dozens of phones had captured every moment of Blake Harrison's public humiliation and Marcus Thompson's calculated victory. As the courtyard emptied, Danny approached Marcus with tentative steps. "Thank you," he said simply. "No one's ever stood up for me like that before. I don't know how to repay you." His gratitude was genuine and profound, carrying the weight of years of accumulated abuse that had finally found an end. Marcus shouldered his backpack, preparing to face whatever consequences awaited him in Principal Rodriguez's office. "You don't owe me anything, Danny. Just keep being yourself and don't let anyone convince you that studying hard is something to be ashamed of." He glanced back at Blake, who was still gathering soggy papers with his defeated crew. Some people mistake intelligence for weakness, but they're about to learn how wrong they are. The two boys walked toward the main building together, an unlikely partnership forged in the crucible of confrontation. Behind them, Blake Harrison and his crew continued their humiliating cleanup. Their reign of terror at Riverside High effectively ended by a transfer student who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to become something they feared more than they craved power. Marcus knew that Principal Rodriguez would hear about the incident within hours, and that his carefully negotiated second chance at Riverside High might be hanging by a thread. But as he watched Danny Rivera walk with his head held high for the first time in years, clutching borrowed chemistry notes like a lifeline to his academic future, Marcus realized that some consequences were worth accepting. The hallways of Riverside High buzzed with excited whispers and shared videos as news of Blake Harrison's defeat spread through the student body like wildfire. For the first time in years, students walked a little straighter, spoke a little louder, and looked bullies in the eye instead of at the ground. The social ecosystem of the school was changing, and Marcus Thompson had become the catalyst for a transformation that would ripple through every interaction for months to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.